Rain poured down in relentless sheets, turning the bustling city streets into rivers of forgotten dreams. Alexander Thorne, the self-made millionaire whose empire spanned tech startups and luxury real estate, gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black Lamborghini. He was late for a gala where he'd be hailed as Philanthropist of the Year, ironic, considering his philanthropy was mostly tax write-offs. As he sped toward his sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, his phone buzzed with notifications, stock alerts, emails from sycophants. But then, through the blur of his windshield wipers, he saw them, a crumpled heap on the sidewalk just outside his gated driveway. An elderly couple, soaked and motionless, like discarded rags in the storm. Alexander slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding not from the near miss, but from the raw, inexplicable shock that froze him in place. He wasn't the type to stop. Life had taught him early on that vulnerability was a weakness to exploit, not embrace. Orphaned at 12, he'd clawed his way from foster homes to boardrooms, building walls around his heart as impenetrable as the security system around his 20,000 square foot estate. Empathy, that was for the weak. Yet here he was, throwing open the car door, rain drenching his tailored suit as he rushed to their side. The man, frail with a shock of white hair plastered to his forehead, lay protectively over the woman, whose face was pale as porcelain. Their clothes were threadbare, soaked through, and a small, tattered suitcase lay nearby, spilling a few meager possessions into the gutter. "Sir, ma'am, can you hear me?" Alexander shouted over the thunder, kneeling in the mud. The man stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open, blue, piercing, filled with a quiet dignity that hit Alexander like a gut punch. "Help, my wife, please," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible. Alexander didn't hesitate. He scooped the woman into his arms, she was light as a feather, and carried her toward the mansion gates, barking orders into his phone for an ambulance. The man, insisting on walking, leaned on Alexander's arm, his grip surprisingly firm despite the tremors. Inside the opulent foyer, under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, Alexander's staff sprang into action. Blankets, hot tea, dry clothes. The ambulance arrived minutes later, sirens wailing like a belated apology from the universe. As paramedics loaded the couple, Harold and Evelyn, they learned, into the vehicle. Harold clutched Alexander's hand. "God bless you, son. We didn't mean to impose, just needed shelter from the storm." Alexander watched them go, a strange ache blooming in his chest. Who were they? Why here, outside his home? He could have driven past, like he had 1,000 times before with beggars or broken down cars. But something, fate, guilt, or the ghost of his own lonely past, had made him stop. The next morning, Alexander visited the hospital, telling himself it was just to tie up loose ends. Harold and Evelyn were in a shared room, hooked to IVs, looking even smaller against the sterile white sheets. Evelyn, recovering from hypothermia and exhaustion, smiled weakly when he entered. She was in her late 70s, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, reminding him of the grandmother he'd never known. Harold, bandaged but alert, sat up straighter. "Mr. Thorne, you saved our lives. We owe you everything." Alexander waved it off, pulling up a chair. "Call me Alex. What happened? How did you end up there?" The story poured out like the rain from the night before, laced with heartache that made Alexander's throat tighten. Harold and Evelyn had been married for 52 years, high school sweethearts from a small town in the Midwest. Harold worked as a mechanic, Evelyn as a schoolteacher. They raised 2 kids, a son who became a doctor, a daughter who pursued art in New York. Life was simple, joyful, family dinners, summer picnics, saving pennies for retirement, dreams of traveling the world. But then, the challenges began piling up like storm clouds. First, their son, Michael, was diagnosed with leukemia at 35. The treatments drained their savings. Harold sold his beloved classic car, Evelyn pawned her wedding ring, anything to keep him alive. Michael fought valiantly, but after 2 years, he passed, leaving behind a wife and young daughter. The grief was a black hole, sucking the light from their days. Their daughter, Sarah, tried to help, but she was struggling herself, divorced, working odd jobs in the city. Then came the flood, literal and metaphorical. A historic storm ravaged their hometown, destroying their modest house. Insurance covered little. The policy had lapsed during Michael's illness. Homeless at 75 and 78, they scraped together what they could and headed to the city, hoping Sarah could take them in. But Sarah's apartment was tiny, and she was barely making rent. "We didn't want to burden her," Evelyn said, tears welling. We thought we'd find a shelter, but they were full. The rain caught us, and we just collapsed. Right outside your home, of all places. Alexander listened, his usual stoic facade cracking. He saw echoes of his own life in their tale, the loss of family, the relentless grind of survival. As a kid in foster care, he'd been shuffled from home to home, learning to trust no one. Success had come at a cost, isolation. No wife, no kids, just empty rooms filled with expensive art he never looked at. "Why my place?" he asked, voice rough. Harold chuckled softly. "Fate, maybe, or God. We were walking, lost, and saw your gates. Looked like a castle from a fairy tale." Evelyn said, "If only we could rest there." And then, well, you know. That night, back in his mansion, Alexander couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the storm raged inside him. He paced the echoing halls, memories flooding back. The day his parents died in a car crash, the foster families who saw him as a paycheck, the ruthless business deals that built his fortune but left him hollow. For the first time in years, he cried, ugly, heaving sobs for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd become. The next day, he returned to the hospital with a plan. "You're not going back to the streets," he declared. Harold and Evelyn protested, they weren't charity cases. But Alexander insisted. He arranged for them to stay in his guest house, a cozy cottage on the property he'd never used. "It's temporary," he said, "until we sort things out." Reluctantly, they agreed, moved by his unexpected kindness. As days turned to weeks, the real transformation began. Alexander visited often, at first awkwardly, bringing groceries or newspapers. Evelyn, with her teacher's warmth, drew him out. She shared stories of her classroom days, how she'd inspired kids from broken homes, like him. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Alex. Even millionaires." Harold, tinkering in the garage, fixed Alexander's old motorcycle, a relic from his rebellious youth. "Machines are easy," Harold said one afternoon, oil on his hands. "People, that's where the real work is." Challenges arose, testing their fragile bond. Sarah arrived, skeptical of this rich stranger, helping her parents. "What's your angle?" she demanded, her artist's eyes sharp with distrust. Alexander admitted his past, his loneliness. "No angle, just trying to do right." Slowly, Sarah softened, sharing her paintings, vibrant scenes of loss and hope that mirrored his soul. Then, Evelyn's health faltered. A routine checkup revealed heart issues, exacerbated by years of stress. Surgery was needed, but costly. Alexander offered to pay, but Harold refused at first. "We've taken enough." It led to a heated argument, Alexander's old walls rising. "Why won't you let me help? Is it pride?" Harold shot back. "Pride's all we have left after everything." The resolution came in a quiet moment under the stars. Alexander confessed his fears, that helping them was selfish, a way to fill his empty life. Evelyn, from her hospital bed post-surgery, took his hand. "Kindness isn't selfish, dear. It's human. You've given us more than money, a family again." Harold nodded, tears in his eyes. "And you've reminded us we're not alone." With Alexander's resources, they rebuilt. He funded Sarah's art studio, helped Harold start a small mechanic workshop for veterans. The guest house became permanent, family dinners filled the mansion with laughter for the first time. Alexander even reconnected with distant relatives, inspired by their resilience. 1 year later, on a sunny afternoon, Alexander stood in his garden, watching Harold and Evelyn dance slowly to an old jazz record, Evelyn's new heart strong, their spirits unbreakable. Sarah painted the scene, capturing the joy. Alexander realized true wealth wasn't in bank accounts but in connections, in lifting others when they fall. As the sun set, casting golden hues over the estate, Alexander whispered to himself, "Sometimes, the storm outside leads you to the one within, and that's where the real healing begins." The elderly couple, once collapsed in despair, had risen to teach a millionaire the value of a compassionate heart. And in that lesson lay the inspiration: no matter how high we climb, we're all just one storm away from needing a hand. Reach out, and you might just save yourself too.